So, without further ado, let's welcome him, Jeremy Scahill.
Oh, thank you. This is an amazing crowd here. It's really great to be with all of you. Happy Cinco de Mayo. Yeah. I'll be mixing margaritas later for everyone. Yeah. But also, you know, we're just a few days after May Day, so let's hear it for all of the workers. I'll try to speak loudly so that our friends that are up here, can you guys hear me okay? Is that all right? I mean, I do have a loud mouth, as my mom told me, so I think we're not going to have that much of a problem. You know, we're living in a reality right now in our world where we have a popular Democratic president who is a constitutional law expert by trade and who won the Nobel Peace Prize, who is going to have as one of his enduring foreign policy legacies the centralization and normalization, and in some cases legitimization, of assassination as a central component of what is called U.S. national security policy. And I think that we're living in a polarized climate where a lot of liberals have bought into the idea that President Obama is waging a smarter war than his predecessors, and that he actually has been a transformational figure on a foreign policy level. But I think that what it basically is selling a lot of people a bill of goods. I don't believe for a moment that if John McCain had won the election in 2008 or Mitt Romney won it in 2012, that you would be seeing polls suggesting that 70% of self-identified liberals support these drone strikes, and that support for the strikes drops only negligibly when the target in question is a U.S. citizen. And so part of why I called this book Dirty Wars was not because I wanted to be a master of the obvious and try to say that people don't know that war, you know, is in fact dirty no matter what kind of a war it is, but as a sort of pushback on this idea that drone strikes and cruise missile strikes are a clean form of war. But it also was an attempt almost in a macabre tip of the hat to a different era in U.S. foreign policy in the 1970s and 80s, where the U.S. was thoroughly invested in these dirty wars in Central America, in Nicaragua, El Salvador, in Honduras, where the U.S. was in Nicaragua funding and arming the Contra death squads, and in Honduras supporting Battalion 316, the murderous gangsters that were getting support from the CIA. And in those wars that were largely fueled by the Reagan-Bush White House, you had the full spectrum of U.S. covert actions taking place. You had mercenaries, support for death squads, the propping up of anti-democratic dictatorships, and you had the presence of covert U.S. military units as well as paramilitaries from the CIA. What the Obama administration has done over the past 5 years is to really intensify U.S. covert operations around the world and to expand the number of countries where U.S. forces are engaged in bombing campaigns. Over the past several years, I've spent time traveling in Yemen and Somalia and Afghanistan and elsewhere, trying to do a few things. One is to humanize the people who live on the other side of the missiles. The people who had their village cluster bombed in Yemen in December of 2009. The folks in Afghanistan and Gardez who were victims of a U.S. night raid, and they were killed, and then the American soldiers tried to cover up the killing of this family, including 3 women, 2 of whom were pregnant, by digging the bullets out of their body and then saying that they had stumbled upon a Taliban massacre. Trying to put a human face to the people that live in these countries that are being targeted, but also to tell the stories of the special operations forces and the people that work for the CIA's Special Activities Division, who are responsible for hunting down and killing the people that have been designated by the popular Democratic law professor, Nobel Peace Prize winning president, for assassination. And in telling those stories, I think we can get a more complete understanding of just how far things have gone, how far across the line we've stepped since 9/11 in this country and around the world. For me, one of the most sort of devastating incidents that took place, that took us across the line, and I think it'll be very hard to walk back from it, was the 2-week period in September and October of 2011 when President Obama authorized a series of drone strikes in Yemen that resulted in the killing of 3 US citizens, one of whom was a 16-year-old boy that had nothing to do with terrorism whatsoever. I believe on a moral level that it doesn't matter whether you're an American or a Pakistani or a Yemeni or an Afghan, that we should not have any greater rage at the killing of someone just because they happen to have been born in the United States. It has no difference to me as a human being whatsoever. But I think that this story is an important one for particularly residents of the United States, citizens of the United States, to confront. Because if the President of the United States can place American citizens on a kill list without even charging them with a crime or presenting evidence against them, that's not only immoral, it's potentially unconstitutional. And it raises issues that should be confronted by our society. The drone program as a whole, the targeted killing program as a whole, should be confronted. But when it comes to the killing of US citizens and placing them on a list for assassination, there are other layers to that story. So I say this before I tell you the story that I want to tell you, because I want to make it clear that to me it doesn't matter whether you're an American or a non-American. Your citizenship bears no relevance to what rights you should have as a human being. I remember seeing Anwar al-Awlaki on television after 9/11. And I remember him because I was working as a producer, a young producer on Amy Goodman's show Democracy Now! And I remember I remember trying to actually book him as a guest on the show, because Anwar al-Awlaki was an American citizen who was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico. He was the imam at a very large, popular mosque in Falls Church, Virginia, the Dar al-Hijra Religious Center. And he was giving sermons and interviews to major US media outlets like the Washington Post. He was on NPR, he was on NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. And in his sermons and in his media interviews, he was saying that as a Muslim and as an American, he was outraged at the events that took place on September 11th. He said that he wanted those who were behind those attacks to be brought to justice. He even said that the United States had a right militarily to go into Afghanistan to try to dismantle the al-Qaeda network. And he said that al-Qaeda had perverted the religion of Islam. He also was facing a reality that many Muslims in the United States were confronted with after 9/11, where there was this incredible bigotry and there was the targeting of Muslims, and Guantanamo was opened. In fact, the day after September 11th, a Muslim woman stumbled into al-Awlaki's mosque after being beaten with a baseball bat. And he heard the stories in his community of people getting visited by the FBI and being harassed at their jobs. And he was dealing as a religious figure with his own community, and at the same time was becoming a sort of media celebrity who was articulating a position about the experience that many Muslims were having in this country post 9/11. And we never were able to get him to come on the show, but I was trying to, because I thought he represented a very important voice at that moment. Al-Awlaki was such a respected figure within the establishment in DC at the time that he was actually invited by the Pentagon to come and give a speech soon after 9/11 at a luncheon. And we got the documents from that invitation. He ends up going to the Pentagon after 9/11 and giving a speech about the state of Islam in the world. And just to give you a sense of how bad U.S. intelligence really was at the time, among the sandwiches that they served was a sandwich with bacon in it. They invited this imam to go and give a speech at a luncheon, and then they serve a bacon sandwich. But I'm sure al-Awlaki didn't, that's not what he chose for his lunch that day, but he was this figure who, even within the U.S. military, they viewed him as an important voice. We all have seen this kind of cartoonish portrayal of who he was in life that's based largely on the last 2 or 3 years of his life. And I'm sure many of you have seen the videos on YouTube of Anwar al-Awlaki where he's sitting there with a camouflage jacket on in front of a black flag, and he's calling for armed jihad against the United States, and he's calling on young people in the United States who are Muslim to either fight in their own country or to come to Afghanistan or Yemen or Somalia and struggle on the front lines of the jihad against the US and Israeli forces around the world. But Anwar al-Awlaki was not a guy who became radicalized or made those videos out of a vacuum. He also wasn't raised by parents who are in line with what he was saying in those videos. His dad, Dr. Nasser al-Awlaki, was a very well-respected engineer who came to the United States on a Fulbright scholarship in 1966. And the family shared with me, they opened their entire archives to me, and I got a clear sense of who the al-Awlakis are and who they were at the time. So how does a guy go from being a moderate imam, as he was called in the US press, a man who's invited to Pentagon luncheons, to a guy who is sitting with a camouflage jacket in front of a black flag and calling for attacks against the United States? He was very much, Anwar al-Awlaki, a product of American foreign policy and American domestic policy toward Muslims. He started to see the United States in a very different light based on the experience of people who would come to his mosque, the harassment that they were enduring. He saw the humiliation of Muslims in the US prison in Guantanamo, which of course is a shameful stain on our society that it remains open to this day. He was being pressured by the FBI to become an informant when he was an imam at the mosque. They repeatedly questioned him after 9/11. He had a public life where he's on TV and a private life where he's dealing with Muslims under attack and also the FBI trying to flip him. I also think it's possible that al-Awlaki had, to some degree, been flipped and was cooperating with the FBI, and I tell that story in the book. But he ultimately ends up leaving the United States, and he goes to Britain and then ultimately back to Yemen, where his family's ancestral roots are. And he starts to, his recordings and his sermons, which historically had been about the teachings of the Quran and various prophets and holy figures in both Christianity and Islam. And his sermons, though, as the U.S. wars spread, as the invasion of Iraq occurred, as the photos came out from Abu Ghraib, as the war against Muslims in the United States and in countries around Europe intensified, he started to become more sharp in his critique of American foreign policy. And in 2006, he was in Yemen, where he was recording his sermons and he was attending school and trying to figure out what to do with his life, when he was arrested by the US-backed counterterrorism unit in Yemen and put in prison for 18 months, 17 of them in solitary confinement. And I reviewed Anwar al-Awlaki's prison writings, and you see a man who is being changed by what's happened to him, and by being put in prison. And he believed firmly that he was in prison on the orders of the United States because he was being held without charge. And the United Nations investigated his imprisonment, and they said that it was an extra-legal detention of Anwar al-Awlaki. They had some trumped-up charge about him intervening in a tribal dispute. I met former Yemeni officials who told me that when al-Awlaki was in prison, all of these tribal figures in Yemen were demanding his release and saying, you can't just hold one of our citizens without charge because a foreign power wants him there. And there's pressure mounting. And so the Yemeni ambassador to the United States meets with Bandar Bush, who is the powerful Saudi diplomat whose nickname is Bandar Bush because of his close relationship with the Bush family, and John Negroponte, who at the time was the Director of National Intelligence and was a key figure in the dirty wars that the U.S. was fueling in Central America during the 1980s. when he was the proconsul in Honduras, and one of the key figures in U.S. financing and arming of the Contras. So Negroponte meets while Anwar al-Awlaki is in prison with Yemen's ambassador and with Bandar Bush. And Negroponte, according to my sources, said that the U.S. position is that we want Anwar al-Awlaki kept in prison for 4 or 5 years so that young Muslims start to forget about him. Because they were fearful that his sermons were going to inspire what they called lone wolf terrorists, and that his name was popping up as a popular figure in various Muslim diaspora communities in Europe and in the United States. And so basically the United States wanted him kept in prison so that his speech would stop, so that he couldn't release his sermons. And eventually the Yemeni government, because of tremendous pressure inside the country, is forced to release Anwar al-Awlaki. And he comes out of prison a totally changed man. And he is celebrating the rise of the Islamic Courts Union government in Mogadishu and Somalia, where they overthrew the CIA-backed warlords. He sent salutations to Harakat Shabab Mujahideen, which is the Islamist militant movement in Somalia that recently pledged its allegiance to al-Qaeda, but at the time was part of this broader movement of Islamic leaders and Islamic Sharia courts to get rid of the CIA's warlords. And he starts to debate the question of whether suicide bombing is acceptable under the teachings in the Quran, and is very clearly shifting toward a position where he views himself and his religion at war against the United States. And he starts a blog called Imam Anwar's blog, and the internet sort of becomes his mosque, and he has this vibrant comment section where he's answering questions from people around the world, and the U.S. was pressuring the Yemeni government to rearrest Anwar al-Awlaki, and they wanted him to be put back in prison. And eventually al-Awlaki decides he's going to leave the capital of Sana'a, and he goes to the hinterlands of Shebwa province in the south of Yemen, where he wants to try to hide from the pressures of the Yemeni regime and the pressures that Washington is putting on them. And he's living there, and the head of Yemen's intelligence agency comes to his parents and they say to him, if you don't get Anwar to come back and surrender into our custody, the Americans are going to kill him with a drone. This was before the underwear bomber. This was before Nidal Hassan shot up the army base in Fort Hood, Texas. This was before anyone suggested that Anwar al-Awlaki had anything to do with any specific attacks against the United States or specific acts of terrorism. And Anwar al-Awlaki's position was, I'm not going to surrender when there's no charges against me. And the last time that his father, Dr. Nasser al-Awlaki, went to meet with him was in May of 2009, and his father said to him, I am afraid that they're going to kill you with a drone if you don't come back to Sana'a, and asked his son to come. And Anwar said to his father, basically, I'm not going to have you serving as an agent for the Americans, and I won't allow them to tell me which way to position my bed at night. I was born free and I'll die free. And so al-Awlaki decides that he's not going to have anything to do anymore with U.S.-backed prisons in Yemen, and that he's ultimately going to have to go underground. And he leaves his small family, he had 3 children, and his wife, in the care of his parents. And his children also were American citizens. His eldest son, Abdul Rahman, was born in August 1995 in Denver, Colorado. And those kids, and Anwar al-Awlaki did the right thing in leaving his family behind. Those kids were being raised by their grandparents, and they had plans to send them to the United States to go to university because Anwar al-Awlaki's parents were not Anwar al-Awlaki, and they didn't want his children to be in that kind of confrontation with the United States or any other forces. They wanted them to grow up as normal kids. And so al-Awlaki goes underground. His family is left behind to be raised by his parents. And over the next 2 years, the United States tried to kill Anwar al-Awlaki, by my count, at least a dozen times in drone strikes. The first time that President Obama authorized the bombing of Yemen was December 17, 2009. And the target of the attack was a supposed al-Qaeda leader. He wasn't an al-Qaeda leader at all. When I went and investigated on the ground, he was an old-school mujahideen who had fought on the U.S. side in Afghanistan against the Soviets and had made statements in support of al-Qaeda. But it seems pretty clear that the Yemeni government was under pressure from the Obama administration, and they give them the name of some guy that everyone knows is just basically an old-school mujahideen, and they say he's living in this al-Qaeda training camp. And it's in the middle of nowhere, a tiny village of Bedouins in Al-Majla. And the United States has this perception, according to their intelligence, that they're going after this huge al-Qaeda training camp. And so they wanted to use drones to attack this village on December 17th, 2009, but there were none available because Obama was busy intensifying the drone war in Pakistan. So they had to do a cruise missile attack. So they launched from the sea cruise missiles onto what they believe is an al-Qaeda training camp. And they also used cluster bombs, which are like flying landmines and are banned under international conventions. And I've seen the impact of cluster bombs. The first time I saw it was when I was covering the war in Yugoslavia in the 90s, and the US bombed the niche marketplace and shreds people into meat. So they use cluster bombs, which are the most vicious anti-personnel weapons that I've seen in action, on this village. And they think that they've blown up this al-Qaeda training camp. But they didn't say, hey, we, the United States, bombed this al-Qaeda training camp. The White House sent congratulations to the Yemeni government for its airstrikes on this village, on this al-Qaeda training camp, and said it was a great victory and that they had killed 34 al-Qaeda members. Well, when a young Yemeni journalist named Abdullah Haider Shaya went to the scene of this attack and photographed the missile parts, he realized within a moment that this could not have been the Yemeni military, because Yemen doesn't have cruise missiles made by General Dynamics, and they don't have cluster bombs. So he took photos and he got them to Amnesty International, and he broadcast them on Al Jazeera and elsewhere. And it became clear that the United States was bombing Yemen. There hadn't been a US air attack in Yemen since November of 2002. When the Bush administration did a one-off operation, a drone strike, that also killed a US citizen, though that person wasn't the target of the attack. So President Obama starts bombing Yemen. This young journalist goes there and reveals that it is in fact the United States, not the Yemeni government, despite Washington's congratulations and the Yemeni government's press releases, and starts to report on this. 7 days after that strike took place, the United States tried to kill Anwar al-Awlaki in the second round of bombings that it did on December 24th, 2009. So the air war was beginning. And this journalist, Abdullah Haider Shaya, was reporting on these US missile strikes. He gets arrested one night and beaten and taken to the political security prison in Yemen, which is funded and aided by the United States. And he's told, if you don't stop talking about the bombing of al-Majala, then we're going to put you back in here for good. And they release him onto the street. And he goes back that night, bloodied and beaten, and goes on Al Jazeera and says, I was just arrested. I was threatened by Yemen's counterterrorism unit that if I keep talking about al-Majala, that they're going to put me back in prison, but I won't be silent. And he keeps talking. He's doing what a reporter should be doing, not to be intimidated by the powerful. And what is at the heart of that story of what happened when this missile attack happened is that it wasn't 34 members of al-Qaeda that were killed. I have the list of the dead. There were 46 people killed in that attack. 14 of them were women and 21 were children. When we were in Abyan province, which is where al-Majala is, almost 2 years after that attack, the missile parts are still there in the desert. We took video of US missile parts that say made in the United States, that say General Dynamics, and there are still unexploded cluster bombs there. In fact, children were killed a few days after that bombing by playing with a cluster bomb because it's bright yellow and it has a little parachute on it and it looks like it could be a toy. And this isn't just in Yemen. This has happened repeatedly over the past decade of these US wars where kids find something that they think it's a colorful, shiny object and it explodes. And so you have this Yemeni journalist who's exposing this. They're going after him. The US is trying to kill Anwar al-Awlaki, its own citizen. And Abdullah Haider Shaya then is interviewing Anwar al-Awlaki, manages to find him when the United States can't, and his interviews were published on ABC News, by NBC, the Washington Post, and Abdullah Haider Shaya becomes this figure who is really the on-the-ground reporter exposing these US covert wars. And one day he's out shopping with a friend of his who's a political cartoonist, and he is snatched off the streets and disappeared for 30 days. No one knows where he went. And he was taken back to that prison, and then eventually he was hauled into a court 30 days after originally being taken in a cage. And we have video of this too. He's in a cage in the court, and it was a court set up, a tribunal set up specifically to prosecute journalists who had committed thought crimes against the dictator of Yemen. It was a tribunal that was roundly denounced by every major media and human rights organization in the world. And Abdullah Haider Shaya was sentenced to 5 years in prison in a kangaroo trial where no evidence was actually presented against him. Sentenced to 5 years in prison for being an al-Qaeda facilitator because he had interviewed members of al-Qaeda, which is what journalists should be doing. They should be interviewing the people that we are told are the enemy. And even if I were a member of the CIA and I wanted to understand who the quote-unquote enemy was in Yemen, I would actually want a journalist like Abdullah Haider Shaya out there in the world interviewing these people. But the response instead was to take him and put him in prison and then say he is part of al-Qaeda because he interviews al-Qaeda. Not a single American news organization that ran his stories when it was created a sensational story about an American jihadi cleric who's running around Yemen, not a single one of those media outlets, when Abdullah Haider Shaya was sentenced to 5 years in prison, made a peep about it. None of them raised a single objection to his incarceration, imprisonment, and being accused of being a facilitator for al-Qaeda. And there was such outrage in Yemen over the imprisonment of this journalist that they made huge banners, like big advertisements, and put posters with his face around the capital of Yemen, demanding his release. And then there was pressure from the tribes and pressure from legal organizations to release Abdullah Haider Shaya. And so the US-backed dictator of Yemen decides that he's going to issue a pardon. And as he's preparing the pardon, word of the impending pardon leaks in the Yemeni media. That day, the dictator of Yemen receives a phone call from the White House. Not from some deputy undersecretary of who knows what, not even from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton or the Vice President, from President Obama personally. And President Obama told the dictator of Yemen, "We are deeply concerned about news that you're going to release Abdullah Haider Shaya." And the pardon gets ripped up and he remains in prison to this day. He is still in prison. An independent journalist is in prison in Yemen because of the popular Nobel Peace Prize winning constitutional law expert, Democratic President of the United States. Our president is keeping this journalist in prison. And his crime, as he said when they had him in the cage that day at his fake trial, his crime was exposing the American cruise missile camp that massacred women and children in the Bedouin village of al-Awlaki. It's the last line of my book, the last line of my acknowledgement says that he's still in prison to this day and that he should be freed. And I will not stop talking about this story every time I'm allowed on TV or on the street because it's shameful. And so as the U.S. air war is intensifying in Yemen and they're trying to find Anwar al-Awlaki, they cooked up all of these plots to try to locate this American who they believe may have been involved with the underwear bomb plot and who praised the Fort Hood shooting when Nidal Hassan massacred more than a dozen of his fellow soldiers. And they said that he was plotting ricin attacks against the United States. And maybe everything they've said about Anwar al-Awlaki is true. I mean, I have serious doubts about some of these because I've investigated. But let's just say, for argument's sake, every single thing that's been leaked, that's how we have trials these days, is by leaks from the White House. That's your day in court. That's been true of the situation in Boston thus far, and that's also what's often true of people that we're told are terrorists. You litigate it in the press through leaks. So let's say that everything that they've leaked about Anwar al-Awlaki is 100% true. That he directed the underwear bomb plot. That he was involved with helping Nidal Hassan conduct the Fort Hood massacre. That he was the one responsible for the parcel bomb plots where they put the bombs in printer cartridges and tried to send them to Jewish community centers in the United States. Allow all that for a moment. What is a civilized society that claims to be based on the rule of law? Or to follow its own constitution? What should a country do when one of its own citizens is involved with all of these nefarious plots? You indict them. You present evidence against them, and you put them on trial. And if they're not in the United States, you demand their extradition. And if you can't get them extradited, well, you have all sorts of options of what you could do then. But we skipped right to the death penalty before even issuing an indictment, before even publicly presenting any evidence. When Anwar al-Awlaki found out that he was on the U.S. kill list, it was because of a leak in the media. The Washington Post front page story that this American is on the kill list. And his father, who was this scholar, a former minister, a man who loved the United States, actually thought, this can't be. And he wrote a letter to President Obama, and I published his full letter in the book, and it basically just says, I'm begging you to indict my son if he's committed a crime and not to just simply kill him. And he never received a response to that letter, which was delivered to the White House through a journalist for a major TV network. When he then filed a lawsuit to try to challenge the government's assertion that it could just kill an American citizen without trial, the Treasury Department designated Anwar al-Awlaki as a global terrorist so that he was not allowed to have lawyers. The ACLU and the Center for Constitutional Rights actually had to sue the Treasury Department to get a license to represent an American citizen who had been sentenced to death before being charged with a crime. And then when the case went to trial, the director of the CIA, Leon Panetta, the Defense Secretary, Robert Gates, and the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, all submitted briefs in that trial asserting state secrets privileges. And they said, we have an abundance of evidence against Anwar al-Awlaki that he is involved with all sorts of terrorist plots, but the evidence is too dangerous to be made public. It really is, people say this about a lot of things these days, it really is like something out of Orwell. It is something out of 1984. We know that you did these things, but we don't have to prove to you how we know it, and we don't have to give you a chance to even respond to the allegations against you. If our response to people who are involved with nefarious plots, or do actually want to harm people in our society, if our response to that is to say, well, for certain kinds of people, who often just happen to be Muslim, if for certain kinds of people, the way we should respond is we should round up the posse and pull the pitchforks, out of the shed and light the torches and then go and take them in the middle of the night and serve sort of citizens' justice on them, then stop saying that you're the shining, city on the hill. Or stop saying it matters that the president is a constitutional law expert. Say that you're a different country. Just own what your vision is then for how justice should be administered to people who you have secret evidence against, but it's too dangerous to be made public. For me, the relevance of this story is not about who Anwar al-Awlaki was, though I think it's fascinating because he was a product of our wars, of the US wars. But it's who we are as a society. We shouldn't be judged by how we treat the rich and the powerful. I mean, to an extent we should be, because we should be holding them accountable when they're crooks and crooked banks and all those things. But our values as a society are judged by how we treat the poorest of our people, the least popular of our people, and the most reprehensible of our citizens. So if you have a guy, and al-Awlaki did things I found despicable. He called for the assassination of a specific cartoonist in Seattle, Washington, after she helped organize this draw cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad Day. A lot of Muslims found that offensive, but al-Awlaki took it to the degree he said she should be assassinated. That young woman's life was ruined. She had to go into witness protection, change her name, and leave. He regularly praised attacks against civilians and military personnel alike, and he admitted that he had met with Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib, the underwear bomber, before he went off on his plot. It's not that I have some great love for Anwar al-Awlaki. It's that I believe that how we treat someone like him says a lot about who we are. So they're hunting al-Awlaki, and at one point the CIA, I could tell you the whole story, but I'll just tell you the short version of it. The CIA works with this guy who used to know Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, and he was sort of an aspiring jihadist named Morton Storm. And he was a guy who, when al-Awlaki became this big target for the US, realized he could cash in on it. And so he goes to he's Danish, he goes to the Danish intelligence service and says, I think I can help you guys get Anwar al-Awlaki. And he gets paid $250,000. To Islam, and she and al-Awlaki exchanged these videos. It was sort of their version of OkCupid or something, and they exchanged these videos, and they ultimately decide they're going to get married. And so Amina has no idea that she's being used by the CIA to find Anwar al-Awlaki, and so they purchase this nice designer luggage for her that has tracking devices in it, and then they pay for her flight to fly to Sana'a, where she's going to then liaise with some of al-Awlaki's people, and then they're going to have Amina and her Louis Vuitton bags lead them to Anwar al-Awlaki. She arrives in Yemen, and al-Awlaki's people tell her to ditch the bags, ditch the clothes, change out of it. She goes and ditches it, and the CIA luggage stays behind in Sana'a. She then marries al-Awlaki and has a child with him and spends her life living with him underground. So the CIA facilitated al-Awlaki finding a wife while he was underground. The other thing they did is the CIA approached Anwar al-Awlaki's youngest brother, Ammar, who works for an oil company and spends a lot of time in Europe. He was in Vienna, Austria, and they go to his hotel and say, call him up and say, our wives are friends, this CIA guy tells him, and I have a gift for her. He comes down to the lobby, and the guy doesn't know his wife, and he's CIA, and he basically says, we'll give you $5 million if you tell us where your brother is. And he hadn't seen his brother in years, but they're really trying to sort of look for him in any inkling of intelligence that they have on where al-Awlaki is. They do drone strikes, and they're hunting him down. And finally, on September 30th, 2011, they've located al-Awlaki, and he comes out of a house. He was in the north of Yemen in this place called Khashef. He comes out of a house, and he's with another American from North Carolina named Samir Khan, who is widely believed to be the editor of Inspire magazine, the English language publication of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And the two of them get into a car, they're driving, and the U.S. comes in and blows the car up and then hits it again and kills these two American citizens. And there were basically two categories of reaction in Washington when these two U.S. citizens were killed in this drone strike. Silence or enthusiastic support. You had Hillary Clinton and John McCain spoke as one voice and saying this is a great victory. And you had Dianne Feinstein talking about how much of a strategic strike this was and how important it was to have taken Anwar al-Awlaki out. One Republican congressman said, well, if Samir Khan wasn't a target also, then it was just a bonus. He said it was a twofer, that taking out these two American citizens. The only people in Washington that raised any objection to this were the usual suspects, Congressman Dennis Kucinich and Representative Ron Paul. Those were the two people that actually raised any objection to the targeted killing or the assassination of American citizens who hadn't been charged with any crimes. While al-Awlaki was underground, and a short time before he was killed in that September 30th airstrike, his son, who was living with his grandparents in Sana'a, had just turned 16 years old. And he decided that he was old enough to try to find his father. He hadn't seen him or heard from him in a few years because his dad was on the run. And one morning he woke up and he snuck into his mother's bedroom, and he took the equivalent of about $40 in Yemeni riyals from her purse, and he left a note apologizing for taking the money, and he said, I'm going to go and try to find my father. And he got on a bus in Bab el-Yemen, in the old city at Sana'a, and he went to Shebwa province where he thought his father was, the scene of repeated drone strikes against Anwar al-Awlaki, or attempting to kill him. And he was going to wait there, and while he was waiting there, his father was killed. And his father was killed nowhere near where he thought he was. He was killed, as I said, in the north of Yemen. At the time, there was an uprising against the US-backed dictatorship in Yemen. I mean, people were calling it at the time the Arab Spring, but I've never liked that term. These were uprisings in large part against US-backed dictatorships in the Middle East. And so there's this revolution going on in Yemen, and the roads are closed, and there's fighting between Shebwa and Sana'a. And so Abdulrahman al-Awlaki, the 16-year-old kid, couldn't go back home to his grandparents' house after his father was killed. He had to wait for things to calm down. And one night, on the night of October 14th, 2011, he goes out with his cousin Ahmed, who is 17 years old, and some other young people from their tribe there, and they're having dinner at a sort of makeshift outdoor restaurant when a drone appears above them and fires a missile at them and blows the kids up. 16-year-old Abdulrahman al-Awlaki and these other young people. On October 15th, his grandfather receives a call telling him that Abdulrahman has been killed. And they said, we couldn't recognize all of the body parts, but we know that Abdulrahman is dead because we found part of his head. And we could tell from his hair. He was a kid, if you see pictures of him, who had this big, unruly sort of head of hair, and he was constantly being pressured by his mother and his grandparents to cut it. But he was a rebellious teenager, and he said, "This is my trademark." And I got deep into. I talked to his friends and watched videos of him, and got to really know who this kid was. And he was a totally ordinary teenager who was not engaged in anything political or fanatical. In fact, he spent many of his nights hanging out at Change Square with the nonviolent revolutionaries that were fighting against the US-backed dictatorship in Yemen. He was just getting into this world of politics and was very taken with the uprisings in countries in Yemen and elsewhere. And he was this kid who, I think you can empathize with it, got to an age where he said, I actually think I can find my father, because who I remember is someone very different than the man that I see on the videos with the camouflage jacket and the black flag. And so he's killed in this strike, and his grandfather then is told, we had to bury them in one grave, and they said this can't be a coincidence. How is it? And I have trouble understanding how that could possibly just be a sort of fluke that they kill the father and then 2 weeks later they kill the son. And so we start investigating this and trying to get answers, and no one from the Obama administration has ever publicly said anything about this strike. What happened was that a U.S. military official leaked the idea that al-Awlaki was actually 21 years old, and that he was an al-Qaeda sympathizer, and that he was at an al-Qaeda meeting when they were bombed, and that he was collateral damage. And then they said, well, he was meeting with this guy named Ibrahim al-Bana, who was a propagandist for AQAP. But then it turns out that Ibrahim al-Bana is still alive. We've killed the number 2 man in al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula 12 times this year. We killed him a few weeks ago, a week before he put out an audio tape referencing current events. So, when al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, when they say someone's dead, I believe it. When the U.S. does, I'll wait for al-Qaeda to confirm it, because they have a better track record than the White House at which al-Qaeda people are alive and dead. So they put out a statement saying Ibrahim al-Bana is alive, and it's just a lie to try to justify killing this kid. And no one has ever provided any explanation for this. And then when Robert Gibbs, who was the former White House press secretary, who knows how to talk in a very careful way to the press, was serving as a surrogate on the 2012 Obama re-election campaign, when he was asked about the killing of Abdulrahman al-Awlaki by a young journalist named Sierra Adamson, she said to him, this is a 16-year-old U.S. citizen who was killed without due process. And Robert Gibbs says he should have had a more responsible father. There are few things more shameful in the history of civilization than blaming the killing of a child on who their parent is or was. And for someone like Robert Gibbs to say that man should not be able to appear in public without being confronted for what he said about the killing of this 16-year-old kid. I don't hang out with powerful people in Washington at all. I don't get invited to the Super Soaker fights at Joe Biden's backyard with Chuck Todd and the other boys, and I don't hang out with lobbyists or strings of all these officials. I'm not saying that so that you applaud for it. I'm saying it because that means I also don't have occasion to get comment from a lot of these people because they don't like me very much. And but I recently had opportunity I ran into someone who was a former very senior official in the Obama administration, and I kind of chased him across a parking lot. And eventually he sort of stopped and agreed to talk with me if I agreed not to publish his name. And I don't like doing that with officials. I think it's a really kind of unfortunate part of our journalism, but I think that I'm so baffled as to why this kid was killed that I agreed to talk to him and not use his name. But he was a very senior person who worked directly on the kill program and worked on it when Abdulrahman al-Awlaki was killed. And he told me that when Obama found out that the kid had been killed, that Abdulrahman had been killed, that Obama was very upset, and that they had been told by the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command that Ibrahim al-Bana and some of his cohorts were alone that night, and that Abdulrahman al-Awlaki was not there. And that John Brennan, who at the time was the president's senior counterterrorism advisor, now is the director of the CIA, that Brennan believed that there's no way it could have been a coincidence and that it was an intentional strike on the kid. And this former senior official suggested to me that maybe Yemen had fed intelligence saying that he was an al-Qaeda operative, or maybe they had fed evidence or to suggest that he was 21 years old, but that Brennan didn't believe that it could have been a coincidence, and he ordered a review. That review has never been published. But the senior official, and this is what they always do, assured me there's nothing to see here. I'm sure that it was all just an outrageous mistake, is the phrase that they use. And he said, this is going to be one of those things where it's a damn act of war and it's an outrageous mistake. And I said, well, if that's true, if it's true that it's a mistake, why not say that to the American people or say that to that family? Why not admit that you killed this kid and tell us exactly how it was that he got killed? And he said, look at what we were facing. We killed 3 American citizens in a 2-week period, 2 of whom weren't even targets, Samir Khan and Abdulrahman al-Awlaki. That didn't look good. It was embarrassing. That's the end note. That's the last word we have at this moment. The reason they won't explain why they killed a 16-year-old U.S. citizen who had never been involved with anything vaguely resembling terrorism or plots against the United States and had a dream of coming to university in the U.S. is that we can't explain to you why this happened because it's embarrassing, politically embarrassing. That's just despicable. That's the sort of last word on this. We shouldn't be having correspondence dinners where the rich and powerful and comedians are yucking it up with the most powerful man on earth who has time to joke around with them but not time to explain to us why you're killing a 16-year-old kid who hasn't been charged with a crime and no evidence being presented against him. I want to wrap up in a moment and give people a chance if you want to ask questions or say something about any of what I've said, but to say this, that in the course of working on this book and the film, we traveled to Somalia, where we moved around Mogadishu and other parts of that country with warlords who were on the CIA payroll. We talked to people who had been put into a prison that's buried in the basement of Somalia's National Security Service, which is a US-funded entity. Under President Obama, renditions are continuing. The use of secret prisons are continuing. It's a dime's worth of difference. If you have the CIA running a black site in Poland, and then you have your Somali proxies running it for you in Mogadishu, what's the actual difference between those two things? Well, you don't have to tell Congress that you're in the secret prison business, and you can act as though you've radically changed something from the way that Bush and Cheney did it. Instead of actually using the CIA's Cessnas to render someone, you go back to doing what Bill Clinton would do, which is to say to the authorities in Kenya, we want you to go and snatch this person and bring them to this prison, and then we'll have our people come in and direct the interrogations. We found that was what's happening in Somalia, that there was a new base built at the airport, at Adenade Airport in Mogadishu, a counterterrorism center where the CIA and US military intelligence are paying Somalis $200 a month to serve as part of a kill-capture team against al-Shabaab and other groups inside of Somalia. We went and traveled throughout southern Yemen, where we met with tribal leaders who said, you say that al-Qaeda is terrorism, we say your drones are terrorism. Where the US is actually encouraging the very forces it claims to be defeating or seeking to defeat. I believe that in Yemen, we're actually making more enemies than we are destroying terrorists or terror networks. We are going to ignore the impact of our own policies at our own peril. Because this is going to come back around and hit us. There will be blowback from what we've done over the past decade plus in countries around the world. And don't think for a minute that the people that have lost loved ones in these drone strikes or missile strikes or night raids, that they're just going to forget about it. My biggest fear about this, beyond just that we're killing so many people, including so many people that had nothing to do with anything vaguely resembling posing a threat to the United States, my biggest fear is that we're going to give people a legitimate reason to want to attack us, that they're actually going to have a motivation that would be tough to argue with. How do you argue with someone who says to you that the night they came in and killed my pregnant wife in front of my eyes, I went from loving the United States to wanting to put on a suicide vest and blow myself up among the Americans? How can you say to that person, that's a radical position? Or to say to that person, you're an extremist, or you're a potential terrorist? Who's the one that can look them in the eye and say, I want someone to pay for what you just did to my family? Isn't that sort of what the response that the United States had to 9/11? Isn't that exactly what happened? We said we're going to respond to this by going in, and in some cases invading countries that had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11, and had a president who called it a crusade as he started to launch a war against multiple Muslim countries. We are inspiring a new generation of people who have watched as their parents and grandparents have been collectively punished, collectively humiliated. And they're going to grow up with a very different mentality than the people that they lost in the drone strike had about the United States or about the world. The last thing I'll say is this. When the Boston Marathon bombing happened, and Rupert Murdoch decided to put pictures of young track stars on the cover of the New York Post and said bag men, and these are the people the feds are looking for, and try to ruin the lives of these young people that had nothing to do with the Boston bombing whatsoever. And you had all of this hysteria about spotting what does a Muslim even look like? Spotting Muslim men in Boston that was being talked about in the media, and they just got every possible thing wrong on CNN and MSNBC. The speculation mill was in full swing. I was invited on one of those shows during the immediate aftermath of Boston. I was on MSNBC. I was being interviewed by Martin Bashir, and he said to me at the top of the show, he tried to sort of imply that al-Awlaki or Inspire magazine had something to do. It's like zombie al-Awlaki. He's still engaged in plots even though he's been dead for 2 years. So they're asking me to comment on this, and I said, well, at the risk of seeming out of place on cable news, I don't want to speculate on that. Because I think that that's a big part of our problem in our societies, that we're so quick to judge that we're whipping up the hysteria. And then Lindsey Graham says he should be an enemy combatant. The Tsarnaev kid should be sent to Guantanamo, even though he's an American citizen. And you have this hysteria mill around all of these incidents. And we're gripped by fear. And Boston is locked down for the night. And we're such a timid society when we have to face any of the violence on our own shores. But some of the media coverage was spectacular. The media coverage of the heroes like Carlos Arredondo, who raced toward the center of the blast, and you see that iconic picture of him. And he lost his son in Iraq, and recently lost another one of his children. And he ran toward the bomb blast, and there's that picture of him rushing the young man who lost both of his legs in the bomb blast, rushing him and trying to tie his legs so that the bleeding will abate a bit. And we know the story of the kid, the 8-year-old kid, who had painted that beautiful peace painting. And we know part of what his dreams were in life and what was taken away from all of us when that kid was killed. And we saw the president describe the Chinese graduate student and actually said her name, on television. And I was with a friend from China about a week and a half ago, and she told me that after that woman's name was mentioned by the president, that there was a blog post written in China that went viral, and that the title of the blog post was, "Where You Die Matters." And the point of it was that the president never would have mentioned this young woman from China if she had died in a factory explosion making a product for US consumers. But because she died in Boston, her death actually mattered, and her life, therefore, mattered. Because that's really what all of that's about. Good reporting on the victims of any of these incidents is reporting that humanizes those people, so that you realize it's not just that their death mattered, it's that their life actually mattered. And so we see them as us. It was the same at Sandy Hook and Newtown and the Virginia Tech massacre. We saw the people that were there who died or were the heroes that tried to stop the carnage as human beings. Fareeha al-Muslimi, who's a young Yemeni guy that I know, I met him in Yemen, and he testified in front of the US Senate a few weeks ago, and he was being interviewed by all these media organizations who, it's like they've never heard that there's Yemenis to interview about the war that we're waging in their own country, so he comes and it's like a pile-on. He becomes the most famous Yemeni in the world. But he was asked in one interview about his reaction to the Boston Marathon bombing, and he said, the difference between me and you is I condemn both that bombing and your bombing in my country. That's the difference between us. And but there's something that's so powerful about that sentiment. Because what if the 46 people that were killed at Al-Majla, including 21 children and 14 women, what if we saw the picture that one of those little kids painted and heard about what she wanted to do when she grew up? Or what about the mother who is struggling as a single mother who lost all of her children in that bombing? What if we knew something about what her daily life was like before our cruise missiles came to liberate them from an al-Qaeda training camp that was never there? What if they were people to us? What if they were human beings? What if that's how our journalists covered these stories, just like we cover it when it happens in Boston or in Connecticut? What if they were human beings too? I don't believe for a moment that this government would be able to continue with these policies if we were forced to recognize the humanity of the people that live on the other side of our missiles. I said before that who we are as a society is defined by how we treat the least of our people, the poorest of our people, the most reprehensible. But I also believe that your principles are tested when someone that you may have voted for is in power, or that you may see as the lesser of two evils, or that you say, well, at least we don't have Bush and Cheney anymore. It's easy to be against a war when people like Bush and Cheney are running it. What's difficult is to actually have spine or principles when someone like Barack Obama is president. That's when your principles are tested. Because if we don't take a stand and say that it's wrong when the Republicans do it and it's wrong when the Democrats do it, then it's not principle. What it is serving a partisan political cause. It's not actually believing in something. And that's a challenge in times like these, is to be the actual person that you believe you are, even when your guy is in office, or even when you think, I'm glad that Bush isn't president. Who you are is defined by how you treat the little people in the world and by how you confront those in power, even if you happen to have voted for them. Thank you very much.